got a very full agenda, and we're going to highlight and explore different aspects of the Cultural Heritage Impact Assessment Guidelines. As I mentioned, there'll be opportunities for questions after every session, and also we'll have a break after session 3 with Bryn, and another one after session 5 with Richard. Given the number of people attending today's session, we've got, I think it's over 180 people have registered, and I can see the numbers coming up all the time. We would ask you to use the chat function, and we'll do our best to get to the comments either into the session today or else after session. We'll come back to you later on. What we hope at the end of today's session, you'll have great familiarity with the guidelines. You'll understand the essential requirements, be aware of the information and surveys required, and aware of how significance effect will be determined, and also about the importance of data management and geospatial data. And as you will all know, these guidelines were originally published in February 2024, just over a year ago, replacing the original NRA ones from the 2000s. And these guidelines have been developed to ensure a consistent approach, capturing the emerging best practices and taking account of legislation. These guidelines are to be used on all national road and greenway schemes where TII is a approving authority, sponsoring agency or funder, and we expect it in our operation across our projects. Discussions on precise applicability should be had in the first instance with project archaeologist and a project manager. The guidelines themselves are underpinned by a key set of principles which refer to throughout today's session, especially consistency, professional judgment and proportionality. One of the strengths of the guidelines has been the feedback, inputs and comments which were received during their development from the various stakeholders, including consultants, practitioners and statutory authorities. And I'd also like to thank those who contributed to today's session through various comments when we advertised it back in January. In developing these guidelines, TII and AMS, we're very conscious of the changing landscape in terms of external publications, such as the EPA 2022 guidelines, and of course TII's own suite of publications, including our Sustainability Implementation Plan and the Project Management Guidelines. The TII guidelines are not a static document and will be updated in the coming years and as need arises. And one of the key things that I expect we'll be updating is in the light of the Historic and Archaeological Heritage and Miscellaneous Provisions Act. Once that is fully implemented, we're going to review and update these guidelines as necessary. And as always, when dealing with any TII guidelines, it is essential to check tipublications.ie for the most up-to-date version. Before I finish, I want to mention the accompanying standards. Last year, we decided not to proceed with them as we felt the guidelines themselves are sufficient. However, we may revisit this decision in the future, depending on whether or not we see a need arising. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed today's session, and please feel free to contact myself or Bryn afterwards. So with that, I'm going to hand you back to Bryn. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronan, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. So in this first session, we're going to look at the essential requirements of the new guidelines. Apologies, that's the wrong direction. So I'm going to be looking at the aims and objectives of Cultural Heritage Impact Assessment. I'm going to look at the 4-step process that's laid out in the guidelines. I'm going to have a quick look at mitigation measures, and then the tasks and deliverables of each of the phases and stages. So as Ronan mentioned earlier, the Cultural Heritage Guidelines are designed to align with TI's suite of documents, Project Management Guidelines, Project Managers Manuals, and Project Appraisal Guidelines for major and minor road schemes, and also for greenway projects. If you just think back to what the aims and objectives of TI's Archaeology and Heritage Unit is, the primary objective is to minimise the archaeological and heritage impacts associated with TI capital projects and programmes. And as Ronan mentioned, this is all about compliance with legislation, legal requirements and regulations. It's about reducing risk, and it's about maintaining public trust and delivering social benefits and value. So TI's commitment to protecting our archaeological heritage is laid out in the Code of Practice that was signed with the Minister back in 2017. That Code of Practice commits TII to assign project archaeologists, to commit funding for archaeological investigations and dissemination of information. And also there's a code of best practice as well for national and regional greenways, which also encapsulates the requirement to address archaeology. So in terms of these particular guidelines that we're here to discuss today, the main objectives are to minimise the impact on cultural heritage from TI projects and to enhance the opportunities for cultural heritage where possible, for example, through improved access, amenity and knowledge sharing. What is cultural heritage? So in the new guidelines, we've taken a very all-encompassing view of what cultural heritage is. We've taken it as a broad umbrella term, which encapsulates things that we're all very familiar with, such as archaeological heritage and built heritage, but also other forms of tangible heritage that we need to think about, portable heritage, archaeological objects, and so on, and intangible heritage as well, such as folklore and history. So why do we need to minimize or avoid impacts? Well, as I mentioned, there are legal requirements to do so under national legislation and as well as international treaties and conventions. We have an EIA directive, which requires us to avoid, prevent, reduce, or remedy or offset adverse effects. We have government policies, including the Seminole Policy Framework and Principles, which requires us to avoid archaeological impacts wherever possible, to preserve in situ, where that is not possible to preserve by record. All of this, of course, is tied up with the approvals process as well. I've already mentioned the code of practice. And this is about minimizing risk, avoiding unnecessary impacts, which also then avoids unnecessary program delays and costs, and of course delivering public benefit as well, benefiting all of society and the values that they hold in relation to our shared cultural heritage. Now, the Cultural Heritage Regulatory and Policy Framework is summarized in Appendix 3 of the guidelines. So what is a cultural heritage impact assessment? Well, it's a process for identifying and assessing effects on cultural heritage and, where necessary, developing measures to mitigate adverse effects and/or enhance potential positive effects. The purpose of TII is to understand the consequences of change to cultural heritage receptors so that informed decisions can be made about their sustainable management. It involves identifying cultural heritage receptors, identifying potential impacts, assessing significance of effect, and formulating mitigation and enhancement measures where possible. And it's a process that extends across the project management guidelines, PMG phases 1 to 4, and requires the application of various methodologies and produces various outputs, which we'll be discussing today. And of course, all of this needs to be undertaken by competent, suitably qualified cultural heritage professionals who have sufficient expertise under the supervision of a TII assigned project archaeologist and/or an assigned resident archaeologist from the local authority. So what's driving this? Well, what's driving this is the EIA directive as transposed into Irish law, which requires environmental impact assessment reports to be prepared by suitably competent experts. So this brings us to the 4-step process that needs to be followed for each iteration of cultural heritage impact assessment. And the guidelines are structured around these 4 steps, as you'll see. So step 1, we establish the scope, we confirm the study area and the assessment corridors, we establish what is going to be covered in each phase and stage of assessment and who's doing what. Step 2 is analysis, where we compile a cultural heritage data set, we analyze the data gathered through our research and fieldwork, we assess the effects, and then we formulate suitable mitigation or enhancement measures. An important thing to understand is that this is an iterative process. So as the PMG phases progress from phase 1, constraint study, where we establish scope and the feasibility of the project, through phase 2, option selection, which in itself can be broken down into 3 stages, then phase 3, your design and environmental evaluation. Each of these 4 steps is repeated. You're adding layers of information, you're increasing the focus of your assessment as you go through this process. So there is some back and forth, of course, and there may also be occasions where assessments from one phase or stage are revised in a subsequent phase or stage as more information becomes available. Another concept that's important to understand is, excuse me, that as the geographical scope decreases, the intensity of the research increases. So in phase 1, for example, we start off with a very wide constraint study area. So we're trying to identify the key constraints, the known constraints in that area. We're not trying to identify absolutely everything. It's impractical and unnecessary to try and do so at this early stage. But then as we go to phase 2, where we have our option corridors, we are then undertaking more enhanced fieldwork. So we're in site inspections, we might be doing some geophys, and we'll cover some of the things that we might be doing there. So we're increasing our focus on those corridors. And then obviously then by the time we get to phase 3, where we have a preferred option, proposed project area, the intensity of the research increases even further. So if we look at the 4 steps in a bit more detail now, so step 1, establish the scope of the assessment and confirm the study areas. So this is all about the normal project management stuff that we would do on any project. We agree on the program, we identify the stages, the key stages, what the outputs are, what the communication requirements and protocols are. We confirm our study area or corridors if we're at phase 2 and phase 3, and we confirm the scope. We confirm what the format of the cultural heritage data set is going to be, what types of receptors we're looking at, who is looking at what their credentials are, the sources of information, the methods, and so on. And all of this is summarized in a document known as an assessment method statement. And I won't go through everything here on the screen. Obviously, this is a screen grab from the guidelines, but this sets out what's required in an assessment method statement. If there are archaeologists on the call who are used to preparing method statements for Section 26 licenses, excavation licenses, you'd be familiar with the concept of a method statement. It's a concise document summarizing the methods that are going to be followed. It's also a bespoke document. It's particular to the project and to the receiving environment. It can refer to the guidelines that we're discussing today, but it certainly doesn't need to repeat them. This is all about demonstrating familiarity with the process and conformity in terms of the methods. But it's also setting out obviously very specific things like, as I said before, who is doing what, how the various individuals on the team relate to one another, the steps, the resources, the program. So it should be a practical, focused, and project specific document, but a concise document as well. Now, an important thing to note is that these assessment method statements are required for each phase and stage of the process, and obviously the methodology will evolve from one stage to the next. So in terms of analysis, what does that involve? Well, obviously it involves desktop research. It will involve fieldwork, not necessarily at phase 1 constraint study, but certainly from in phase 2 and phase 3. It may involve specialist surveys and assessments such as LiDAR analysis and geophysics, depending again on the phase and the stage, and it involves consultation. And the outputs from those will be the cultural heritage data set, where this information is stored and managed, geospatial data and mapping, and if specialist reports are involved or specialist surveys are involved, reports for those. So step 3, this is something that Joanne will talk about later, so I won't go into too much detail, but this is about assessing the effects and the outputs of those. Similarly, again, you're generating reports or chapters, you're updating your cultural heritage data set and mapping. You'll be producing a project archive if you're at phase 3, which is the EIA phase, and you're also having input to other forms of assessment and appraisal, such as the multi-criteria analysis, which are processes described in other TII publications. Mitigation measures, as I mentioned before, under the EIA directive, are required to avoid, prevent, reduce, or remedy or offset significant adverse effects. So these are the types of mitigation measures that we need to think about. A built-in mitigation, obviously a mitigation by design, is avoidance. We've identified key constraints, and then the design team hopefully will avoid as many of those as they can. If we have a situation where there is a project in close proximity to a cultural heritage receptor, prevention might be one of the measures that we need to set out. So that's, for example, fencing off a site to make sure there are no inadvertent impacts. If an impact can't be avoided completely, perhaps it can be reduced. So that's another thing that we can consider. And then finally, if those impacts are unavoidable, we would recommend compensatory measures or to remedy or offset the effects. So that would be things like obviously excavation and then dissemination of the information that arises from that. It might be interpretation, it might be enhancement, and we'll look at some of those examples in a moment. So for step 4 mitigation, we're identifying the appropriate measures. We're documenting all this in a cultural heritage mitigation plan, and that then feeds into the schedule of environmental commitments and the construction environmental management plan. So a lot of us on the call, I'm sure, are very familiar with the sorts of mitigation measures when it comes to cultural heritage. For archaeology, obviously there's testing, stage 1 testing, post-consent once a project is nearing construction as part of the enabling works to identify any archaeological sites that were not previously picked up. And there might be testing of anomalies that were picked up on geophysical surveys that were undertaken, but not tested as part of the environmental valuation. Excavation, then, the recording by record that I mentioned earlier. And then we have enhancement measures. There's an example there on the screen of a roadside feature, water feature, monument being restored as part of a project to offset some adverse effects elsewhere. And then the bottom middle there of providing interpretation is another form of enhancement compensation. If it's a greenway, we'll come back to the opportunities for greenways in a moment, but obviously this would be a core aspect of that. Publications, that's a huge part of what TII does, and making sure that all the information, all the new knowledge that is generated through all this work is put out into the public domain for the public good. And then the bottom left, obviously, again, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this, monitoring for any residual risk of previously unidentified archaeology being discovered on the scheme. And these mitigation measures then are embedded in the contracts that go out for phases 5 and 6. Again, we're all very familiar, I'm sure, with these services that are on the screen if we're working in this industry. So your test excavation and surveys, your pre-ex excavation, post-excavation analysis, very important, and then dissemination of the findings and results. So in terms of tasks and deliverables then for each of the phases, so phase 1 is your constraint study for road schemes. And these are the main tasks. So I've already mentioned the first task for each of these phases and stages will be preparing your assessment method statement and confirming your study areas and methodology and so on. Then you will be carrying out your desktop research using the source of information suggested in the guidelines, but not confined to that, obviously. They're non-exhaustive lists of suggested sources of information. We are identifying and mapping the receptors. You're identifying key constraints, particularly at phase 1 constraint study area, constraint study. You're preparing the cultural heritage data set. You're identifying any transboundary issues that need to be considered. So if you're operating close to a county boundary or the Northern Ireland boundary, there may be transboundary issues to consider and certainly in consultation later on. And you're preparing a constraint study report. Now for greenways, the constraint study report will generally be at phase 2, whereas phase 1, you're generating constraints mapping primarily, but the constraints and opportunity report for greenways will be finalized in phase 2. And I think I mentioned earlier for constraint study stage, you're not trying to capture everything. That's impossible to do. It's impractical. So this is all about, as Ronan mentioned at the beginning, proportionality. So you're trying to capture obviously the known sites, but as recorded in various inventories, such as the Historic Environment Viewer. But you're also trying to identify those known key constraints. So national monuments is a good example, or important domain landscapes, for example, as well. They don't have to be all designated. They could be undesignated as well. So you might do some cursory historic map analysis at this stage. So this is an extract from what the cultural heritage data set that we'll be talking about might look like. It doesn't include all of the fields. If you go to Appendix 5 of the guidelines, this is where we suggest what a cultural heritage data set would look like. So obviously this is taking the form, for example, of an Excel spreadsheet, which then can be converted into a CSV and then imported into a geographical information system, a GIS, or it could be done conversely. It could be exported from a GIS in this way. But Richard will be talking more about that later, so I won't go into any more detail on that for now. So again, this is an example table for a constraint study report where we've taken some of the information from that cultural heritage data set and we've presented it in tabular form for the report itself. And you can see at this stage of the process that the information is fairly concise. Okay, so as we move on to phase 2, stage 1, the preliminary options assessment. Again, our tasks involve doing our assessment method statement again. We're repeating that process to confirm the methodology. We're undertaking further research and now obviously focusing on those feasible route options that have been presented to us by the design team. We're carrying out at this stage a survey from accessible land. We're getting familiar with the landscape, with the receiving environment. We're doing targeted site inspections. We don't need to do full walkovers of all the route options at this stage. That will come later on the preferred route. But we are doing targeted site inspections of specific sites that we want to go check out. We're updating our cultural heritage data set with the information that we've gleaned from all this work. We're liaising, of course, with the project archaeologist, project manager, and other professionals on the project team. We may be commissioning specialist surveys, for example, geophysical surveys for particular things that we want to go check out. Might do LiDAR analysis as well at this stage. And then we're reviewing the options, and Joanne will talk about that more later on. And all of the information that we're gathered then is captured in our cultural heritage data set again and our report for this stage. Stage 2 of phase 2. So this is your refined options assessment. And it's pretty much the same process, really, in terms of the methods that we're going through it again. But now we're looking at the selection of refined options. This is a graphical representation of the process, just a different form, which the presentation will be made available, so you can come back to this later in your own time. I think one of the key points to just note for now is that for each option, the cultural heritage professional needs to provide findings of both a quantitative and a qualitative impact assessment. Joanne will talk about this more later on, but what we select as our suggested preferred option will not necessarily be the one with the lowest number of cultural heritage impacts along it. This is where the professional judgment comes in. It's not a numbers game. So there has to be both a quantitative assessment and a qualitative assessment as well. Now, for minor projects less than 5 million euro, the phase 2 stages may be amalgamated. So that's just something to be aware of. It may not be broken down in stage 1, 2, 3. Those phases may be amalgamated. And so the results of the option selection from a cultural heritage point of view would then be captured in a single report to cover that process. So phase 3 is design and environmental evaluation, or your EIA phase, if you like. So this is going to be presented in an EIAR chapter or an environmental report for Part 8 schemes. So this is where we have now our proposed project footprint. And our study area is pretty much the proposed CPO, and we suggest an additional 250 meters surrounding that. And then that may need to be extended in certain cases. And one of the very important things to consider is setting effects as well, which may be of a distance from the scheme, but may obviously be quite significant in some cases and need to be captured. The process, again, is quite similar, but this time we're adding obviously more intensive research on the selected preferred route now at this stage, as the likely adverse effects are becoming more apparent. We're undertaking a full walkover at this stage of the proposed alignment and the proposed corridor. We may be undertaking those specialist assessments that I mentioned. And we're also at this stage now undertaking our impact assessment. So considering what the significance effect is going to be. And as I mentioned, Joanne will be covering that later. And then we come to phase 4, which is the statutory processes. So this is where the project goes, for example, in front of An Bord Pleanála for a planning decision. And so the tasks that are required from the cultural heritage consultant are quite different now compared to those other stages. So one of the things we're doing is we're reviewing submissions that have been presented to us from the public, possibly objectors or people who have concerns about the impact. So we're responding and taking those on board and formulating responses on behalf of the project for those. We may have to prepare errata for the original EIAR chapter if we find new information or if there were mistakes. These things happen. We're also preparing a brief of evidence if there's going to be a public oral hearing, and we may be called to give evidence as cultural heritage expert witness. We're having input, as I mentioned before, on the schedule of environmental commitments. We're updating the cultural heritage mitigation plan that informs that. We are reviewing and reporting on any cultural heritage aspects that may be addressed in the planning decision from the competent authority. We're providing input on the the construction environmental management plan. We're drafting method statements to accompany license applications for archaeological works. In the event of a judicial review, we're preparing affidavits in relation to cultural heritage, providing further information to the legal team. And we're also compiling a project archive as well. So this is the stage where we're about to hand over to a new archaeological contractor who will then take over the project really for phases 5 and 6 and actually do the work of the mitigations and enhancement measures. So it's very, very important, as I'll be talking a bit later on after the break, to make sure that that project archive is concise, is complete, is of a high quality before handover. So that archive will include things like your receptor survey forms, your field notes, your photographs, evidence of consultation that you've undertaken, responses to submission, and so on. It's a dossier basically of all the work that we've done, and we hand that over. Those are the outputs there that I've already mentioned. So just to continue then on that theme of project archives. So the project archives, which are submitted at the end of phase 3 and then also phase 4, will include the cultural heritage data set, the complete cultural heritage data set, all the spatial data that accompanies that, vector layers, which Richard will be describing later on, completed reports, and the guidelines do stipulate that those reports should be submitted in PDF format consisting of a single file for the reports, impact assessment spreadsheets, photographs, field records, and so on. The raw data from LiDAR assessments, geophysical surveys, topo surveys, and the consultations that I mentioned. Now, it's crucial that the cultural heritage data set that is developed for the impact assessment is of a standard format, that it's complete, that it's accurate, and it's compiled to a high degree of quality prior to handover. As I mentioned earlier, Appendix 5 recommends the cultural heritage data format, and Rich will be talking more about that. The project archives and the final cultural heritage mitigation plan are to be submitted at the end of phases 3 and 4, or otherwise as required, as they'll be needed by the archaeological contractor. And cultural heritage professionals are also required to submit a spreadsheet containing the metadata for the final reports that are submitted to be uploaded to TII's digital heritage collections on the digital repository. And there's guidance on that in section 5.6.7. So, Ronan, we can open this now up to questions. That's the end of part 2.
Yeah, thanks, Bryn. You kept a great time. So we've 10 minutes for questions. So if anybody wants to have any questions that they'd like to ask Bryn, or there's a panel of project archaeologists from TII who would be happy to answer some questions either. So if you want to put them into the chat.
One question that did come in by email was, Bryn, when should the CHP be appointed?
As early as possible.
Exactly.
That's the short answer. You want to look. I think you want to involve all your experts as early as you can. To make sure that you've got the best information to hand and the best advice. So certainly, phase 1, as I was mentioning there, the constraint study right from the beginning. Phase 0, I think, is the feasibility, isn't it? So that probably doesn't require input from a cultural heritage professional, but certainly when we start actually compiling cultural heritage data and interpreting that data in terms of what it means for the project, that needs to be done by a cultural heritage professional. So yeah, I would be saying phase 1 as soon as possible.
And I actually think, just picking up on that, I think it's awesome. That's really crucial in terms of the qualitative aspect, that cultural heritage is not a numbers game. Now, I know Joanne's going to be talking about it, getting into significance of effect later on in her session. But I think it's really important that everyone leaving the session today realizes that it's not just about downloading figures from the HEV and expecting that's going to be sufficient, because we are going to be producing evidence that is going to be challenged at oral hearing and through the planning process later on. So I think that's a critical one. And I think the other thing is there's one about the cultural heritage data set. What's the rationale for completing it or for starting it at phase one? Or sorry, commencing, not completing, commencing it.
Yeah, I mean, well, the cultural heritage data set can be thought of as an information management tool, you know. So I mean, you're capturing all this information, all this data. Like you said, you're downloading from the HEV, so that's a great starting point, you know. A lot of the attributes that we're discussing are captured in there. I mean, what we're recommending, what the guidelines recommend, is that each cultural heritage receptor is assigned its own ID number, CH number, if you like. But obviously, there are going to be statutorily assigned reference codes to those. So, for example, if it's on the Sites and Monuments record, there'll be an SMR number. If it's on the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, it'll have an NIAH number. It might have an RPS number as well, Record of Protected Structures. You know, so all of those things are captured in the attributes in those data sets that are easily downloaded and then imported into a spreadsheet, for example, you know. So you don't have to sort of transcribe, you know, what's already available. You know, you can utilize what's there. You can go to data.gov.ie. You can download the CSV files, you know, and the shape files. So a lot of the work is kind of done for you, really, you know. But I mean, this is all about information management. In a constrained study, you could end up with hundreds, possibly even thousands of cultural heritage receptors. So you need to be able to manage that data effectively. So that's why you would start your cultural heritage data set right at the beginning.
There's a question just come into the chat here. If it isn't been covered, Bryn, if it isn't been covered later, can you please elaborate on the rationale for a study area of 250 meters beyond the land take at boundary at phase 3?
Okay. Well, I think, you know, Richard might be covering some of that as well, but I mean, 250-meter study area at phase 3. Yeah, I mean, look, obviously we have to consider the impacts within a specific footprint, project footprint, but it's not just about what's actually, you know, directly in that footprint. You know, because, you know, there can be sites along the corridor that would also have a bearing. But I think one of the most important things that we need to be thinking about here is setting effects, the indirect impacts. You know, it's not just all about digging things out of the ground. You know, there are other types of effects, adverse effects as well, and setting is a very important one, as we all know. You know, from various projects, and those things can be at quite a distance, you know, depending on the topography, the landscape, the field of view. So setting effects is a very important thing to be considering, and so that's one of the reasons why you do want a reasonably wide corridor, and you might need to extend it even further, you know, in particular locations as well. And I think another important, very important point actually to make in relation to all of this as well is that ancillary developments, ancillary projects need to also be factored in to the phase 3 impact assessment as well in the study area wherever possible. And I know some things like, you know, compound locations might not be determined at that stage, you know, but wherever possible, things like compounds, quarries, attenuation ponds, link roads, junctions, all of these things need to be factored in. They're all part of the project. And as we all know, you know, the EIA directive requires us to assess the totality of the project. You know, we can't be splitting things up. So, yes, that's a very important point that I think we need to get across as well, Ronan. So,
okay, and there's another question in here as well. How are the assets which may have their settings changed selected? Are there? Sorry, I'm just going to check this. Hang on.
Are there any?
Sorry, can you pick it up, Ellen? Because I'm part of
Are there are there STVs or ZTVs or ZVIs or a bigger corridor?
okay, so ZTV is its own theoretical view of visibility, you know. And look, this is where I think it's important to mention. I'll come back to this in a moment or after the break, you know, the interactions with other professionals. And when we're talking about things like setting effects and visual impacts, it's very important that the cultural heritage consultant coordinates with the landscape professional on this. So for landscape and visual effects, because there is obviously a huge degree of crossover there, you know. So that's my advice to that question there will be liaise and interact with and coordinate with the landscape professional on those sort of setting effects and visual impacts.
Yeah, we have another question is for you there, Bryn. The volume of data generated can be large. Is there ambition to provide a TII structured project archive system that can be populated to ensure consistency across scheme? And can a digital TII receptor survey form template for use in the field that can perhaps also auto feed into a master CHD template be provided? It's a long question there.
Yeah, it's a question for Ronan.
For Ronan, okay.
Thank you, Bryn.
No problem.
You're welcome. This is part of a broader discussion around how projects, and we're now seeing a lot of projects where they're using Project Mapper and they're creating their own common data environment on projects. So that's one aspect to it. And then on the other side, you'll all be aware of the work we're doing with the digital heritage collections, and the guidelines currently anticipate developing that information into the digital heritage collections. So that's another strand. And then the final strand is actually bringing data, setting up those systems within TI to allow data to be brought in. So yes, ultimately we want to be able to capture all of the data within the TI data environment, because it creates adds to efficiencies later down the line for us to be able to reuse information and not have to go back when a project goes into phase 5, 6, or 7, go back and reinvent the wheel, so to speak. But also when we pick up future projects, that we're able to take on the data. Let's see. There's another question here. If their samples are given unique identifiers from phase 1 rather than using their statutory designations, do we need to maintain the same ID throughout? This means very large gap sequence at later phase, which will need to be explained.
I don't know if Richard wants to come in on that. It's more of a GIS thing, I think, but
sure.
You know, I mean, yeah, okay, I'll hand over to Richard. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The reasoning behind the unique identifier for it is concerning that some of these cultural heritage receptors might have multiple designations. So there might be an SMR, an RMP, they might have a national monument, there might be a national monument. They might also be protected structures. So there are multiple designations for it. Yeah, we would, I think it's set out in the guidance document as well, that the culture, the CHP number for it, the unique number for it remains with that cultural heritage receptor throughout the whole process. And yeah, that will result in gaps in the sequence of numbers. But I think that can be explained within methodology for the EIA or product at the end of the day. And also will be set out in the assessment method statement that's prepared for it. But I suppose the thinking behind that was that it would make it easier to track the progress of the assessment of that particular individual receptor throughout the whole process, rather than redesignating or giving it new numbers at each phase, or just using the existing designations for it, because there might be multiple designations for that particular asset, or that asset might even have multiple archaeological designations for it as well if it's large and multiple SMRs, such as architectural fragments or something like that.
Okay, thanks, Richard.
Can I just add to that just slightly, Richard? Thanks. I think something that I forgot to mention when I was talking about how we've approached cultural heritage as an all-encompassing thing. It's not just that we want to think about archaeological heritage, built heritage, other forms of tangible heritage and intangible heritage. And the reason that we took this approach was that we recognized the multiple layers of meaning and significance that can apply to individual receptors. You know, so like you said, you know, an individual receptor can be both a built heritage asset and of archaeological interest. It can also have intangible significance as well, amenity value and so on. So it's about capturing those multiple layers of meaning. So it's just a point that I wanted to mention, because I forgot to mention it when I was speaking before. But I suppose it kind of speaks to what you're talking about as well, how, you know, you can have multiple statutory reference numbers applied to a single receptor.
Thanks, Bryn, Richard, Ronan. So will we go on to session part 3, the key inputs, Bryn?
Yeah, we
Oh,
can,
there's a
but
coffee break.
we can also go and take a break and come back.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, will we start part 3?
Yeah.
Bryn is going to talk about key inputs.
Okay, so now we're going to look at the key inputs of cultural heritage impact assessment. So those inputs include sources of information, obviously the players, and we'll have a very quick look at roles and responsibilities of the individuals involved, personnel involved, competency and professional judgment. Look at communication and interactions. I touched on a little bit about that before the break. We'll have a quick look at identifying opportunities and some of the principles around that, and also a few comments then on geoarchaeology. So source of information in Fieldbook. This is a table that's in the guidelines, figure 5.7, and it breaks down each of the PMG phases and stages and gives examples of the sources of information and types of fieldwork that might take place for each of those. So for constrained study, that's primarily, well, it is exclusively a desktop. I mean, if you want to go out and drive the study area from public roads, there's nothing stopping you doing that, of course. But primarily it's a constrained study, a desk study. So you're looking at archival sources, cartographic sources, so historical mapping, which is all available online, development plans and heritage plans, online data sets, published sources of information, satellite and aerial imagery, LiDAR data if available, and statutory and non-statutory heritage lists that obviously kind of coincides there with the archival sources. So it's publicly available information. But the key point here is proportionality. As I mentioned before, when we had the graphic on the screen of the various survey areas and corridors, at this stage of the game, the research is very high level. It's based on publicly available information, primarily known receptors, trying to identify key constraints. But as I mentioned, undertaking cursory analysis of satellite imagery and historical maps to try and identify as well perhaps some key things that might have been missed, that might cause issues for design later on. For example, a large domain. In phase 2, stage 1, the preliminary route assessment, you're looking at the same categories of sources, but obviously your research is now more focused on the study area corridors. You'll be bringing in previous investigations along those corridors, so previous excavations, monitoring exercises, and so on. And you might now be doing fieldwork. So surveys from accessible land, targeted site inspections, and possibly also specialist surveys and assessments. I'll talk in a moment very briefly about TII's new automatic detection of LiDAR features. Phase 2, stage 2, again, similar categories of sources, now focused on the refined options. So you might have specific targets along those corridors, the options that you want to hone in on in your research and in your fieldwork as well. So your targeted site inspections, surveys from accessible land, and now your specialist surveys and assessments, bringing in things like LiDAR analysis, possibly geoarchaeology, geophysical surveys, targeted test trenches, test excavations, perhaps of the anomalies that were thrown up by the geophys. You might be doing topographical surveys in certain locations, possibly underwater surveys as well. Now, phase 2, stage 3 does not generally involve particular input from a cultural heritage professional. That's about confirming and clarifying the assessments, and this all feeding into the preferred option selection. So we're generally brought back in then for phase 3 when the preferred project option has been chosen. So this is the design and environmental evaluation stage. And as I mentioned when I had that graphic up showing the various stages, the intensity now is increasing, obviously, on the chosen route. So you're doing more intensive research and more intensive field work. Using all the classes of sources that we mentioned before. bringing in other layers, other types of sources, including environmental information, perhaps historical photographs for a particular built heritage structure. And the specialist reports, as I mentioned before. Consultation, very important. I mean, consultation is important throughout, but particularly now at phase 3, making sure that we have local information. I'll talk about that again briefly. Full walkovers now of the route option, and site inspections, built heritage surveys, and then those specialist assessments and surveys that I mentioned before. So the desktop research can be broken down into various categories. So the archival, cartographic, very important to look at the development plans and the heritage plans of the local authority, to see what the policies and objectives are. And there may be statements in there around domains, for example, around dry stone walls, things like that, making sure all of that's captured. Information from the public consultations as well. Obviously, there's a lot out there online, but at this stage of the game, we need to be undertaking more intense research. So we might be in the archives, we might be in the National Library, we'll be in the local studies library, certainly, for whatever county we're in. We're talking to historical societies. We're making sure that we capture as much information as we can. Satellite imagery, aerial imagery, and the specialist assessments that I already mentioned. So Section 5 and Appendix 2 gives more information on sources. And these are the types of methodologies in terms of fieldwork and specialist assessments that a lot of us would be very familiar with. So LiDAR analysis, your fieldwork surveys, walkover site inspections, geophysical surveys, underwater surveys, built heritage surveys, and particularly when we're dealing with specific structures of architectural heritage significance, it's very important that we have people on board who have the competency to interpret those and understand their special interest. Test excavations and topographical surveys, obviously those, and geophysical surveys and underwater surveys, of course, would all be undertaken under a license. So if people are not familiar with this, this is the new automatic detection of archaeological features. It's a machine learning tool. And TII have published some guidance on this. If you go to TII's publications and search for the guidelines cultural heritage impact assessment that Michael Stanley and Ronan Swan put together, you can see these slides here, and there's links then as well to that and to the guidelines that support it. So important to check those out. Consultation, as I mentioned, during phase 2 and phase 3, those phases will be informed by engagement with stakeholders. And the level of engagement needs to be tailored to the specific circumstances, scale, and complexity of the project and the various phases and stages that we're operating at. Consultation with the statutory consultees is normally carried out by the project team, with the involvement of project archaeologists and possibly the cultural heritage consultant as required or professional. So this is consultation with the National Monument Service, for example, in terms of agreeing a strategy for archaeological investigations, geophys, underwater surveys, and so on, test excavations perhaps. And as we're going through phase 3, working closely with National Monument Service to develop the mitigation strategy for archaeology. If we're dealing with built heritage, there's the National Built Heritage Service within the department, who should also be consulted. And then, of course, we have our local authority heritage officers and architectural conservation officers who need to be consulted as well at appropriate stages. An important aspect of that consultation, for example, in relation to protected structures, will be around confirming the curtilage of protected structures, which would also come under the protection. So it's very important if we're dealing with a domain, for example, to determine whether domain walls are considered to be part of the curtilage or part of the attendant grounds. And so that's something that it is within the remit of the local authority to determine. So public consultation is the process intended to engage the public about the project. It typically involves things like media advertisements, project websites, information days, and so on. And that does provide an opportunity for the public to bring any cultural heritage concerns to our attention. And then there's local consultation. I already mentioned the archaeological societies and historical societies. That's tapping into local knowledge. I mean, every community almost has, the local historians, they're very important, very valuable sources of information that we need to tap into and involve so that we capture as full an understanding of the local significance of places as possible, and, have things that we might miss brought to our attention. And landowners are key here. Landowners and occupiers, farmers, for example, whose families may have lived on land for generations. They know these areas better than we ever will. So it's very important that we find those opportunities to consult with local people wherever possible. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, as I said earlier, under the code of practice, a project archaeologist is assigned by TII to all of these projects, and the project archaeologist is key. And project archaeologist oversees the archaeological aspects of each project, works closely with the project manager to ensure that cultural heritage impact assessments, mitigations, enhancement measures are in accordance with guidelines, legal requirements, and best practice. The PA is the main point of contact as well with the department, which is crucial. PA advises the project team on archaeology, and not just archaeology, of course, all the various forms of cultural heritage that we're talking about this morning, and provides regular updates to the head of archaeology, to Ronan. If you want a breakdown of the responsibilities of the project manager, I'll just direct you there to that presentation that Michael and Ronan put together, which you can access at tipublications.ie/training. And that breaks down the role of the project manager as well. But I think the key thing to understand is that the relationship between the project archaeologist and the project manager is an essential one. So all outputs and deliverables need to be approved by project manager in consultation with the project archaeologist. And it's the same with the assessment method statements that we were talking about earlier. Those method statements need to be approved by both the project archaeologist and the project manager. Cultural heritage professionals, people like ourselves here, what are our roles? What are our responsibilities? Well, our role is to provide expert, independent advice to the project team on archaeological and cultural heritage matters, to undertake all the relevant aspects of the assessment, so desktop research, fieldwork, analysis, write-up, all in line with best practice. We need to interact with the other specialists that are on the team. Obviously, these projects are undertaken by multidisciplinary teams that are assembled by technical advisors or environmental coordinators, that will have other specialists of particular relevance to our assessments, to our work, and vice versa. So landscape is one that I mentioned before the break, and being very important when it comes to setting effects and landscape and visual effects. But I'll return to it in a moment, but there are other key professionals as well that we need to liaise with throughout. And we need to incorporate the findings of those other assessments into our work, or to certainly be cognizant of them. We need to take instruction from the project archaeologist, and we need to address all reasonable comments on the outputs and deliverables that we submit. And as I mentioned before, if the project is going to an oral hearing, we need to prepare briefs of evidence based on our work, and we need to act as expert witness at oral hearings where necessary. And as Ronan mentioned, this is why it's so key that competent cultural heritage professionals are involved throughout, because we may be called upon to defend the assessments in an oral hearing situation. So competency is key. As I mentioned earlier, this derives from the EIA directive, which requires environmental impact assessment reports to be prepared by, in quotes, competent experts. So all cultural heritage professionals who carry out these assessments on TII projects must be suitably qualified, experienced, and competent. And competency is reflected by an appropriate combination of expertise, experience, skills, and knowledge that's recognized in the EPA guidelines. It can be demonstrated then through your qualifications, through your membership of a professional body, though you don't need to be, it's not a requirement. Nobody can be forced to be a member, but you can demonstrate your competency through such membership. And of course, your experience on past projects, this all allows us to demonstrate that, we know what we're doing. Certain tasks may need to be subcontracted to other specialists, for example, geophysics. And if it comes to things like license work, such as test trenching or underwater surveys or geophysics, All of this needs to be undertaken under license, and therefore you need to be license eligible for those works. So Appendix 1 of the guidelines provides a definition of what is a qualified and competent cultural heritage professional. And as I mentioned earlier in response to Ronan's question, cultural heritage professionals should be engaged and consulted throughout the process, phases 1 to 4. And this all is about professional judgment as well, which will be brought to bear throughout the process. So professional judgment is a key requirement in the preparation of all the outputs. It's something that you're going to be applying every day. So it's a key aspect, particularly of the qualitative assessment. I mean, anyone can count the number of impacts along a particular corridor, but it takes a competent cultural heritage professional to undertake the qualitative assessment, because as we were saying earlier, it's not a numbers game, so the option with the lowest number of likely impacts is not necessarily going to be the preferred one. So professional judgment is crucial for correctly interpreting and following legal requirements as well, the guidelines, the best practice, giving sound advice, identifying the key constraints and unrecorded receptors, rating importance and assessing significance, which Joanne will be talking about, formulating mitigation and enhancement strategies, defending the EIA or the oral hearing, and ultimately reducing risk. You want to make sure that you get the right people for the job to reduce the risk. And here's the graphic that I was referring to there earlier about the interactions, the communications, and just how important this is, that all of the specialists on the team interact with one another is crucial. And there are particular overlaps pretty much on all of the other disciplines when it comes to cultural heritage. There's an overlap on all of them, really. We could pick out a couple. I've already picked out landscape, but biodiversity, ecology is another very important one. Historic buildings are often important habitats for bats, for example. And we also don't want to be recommending test trenching in environmentally sensitive areas. Population and human health will look at things like amenity value, social effects, things like sense of place and significance. So it's very important that we're coordinating our assessments. We don't want to contradict one another. We don't want any gaps. So it's very important that we coordinate things. So this can take place in a workshop environment, but we should also be encouraging all the specialists to continue interacting and communicating with one another throughout the process. So we've talked a lot about mitigation, but of course another big aspect of this is about identifying opportunities. I mean, traditionally, when we're doing constraint studies and route selection for road schemes, we're always about avoiding things. And so opportunities often are compensatory. So you're restoring that monument that I showed a photo of to compensate for adverse effects elsewhere. But now the TII is so heavily involved in greenways, the focus has kind of shifted slightly. So now we're actively looking for opportunities to engage with cultural heritage. So it is a different focus. So what we're trying to do is to deliver positive, sustainable outcomes and experiences for people. And this is part of our remit now, is to, particularly on greenways, is to identify those opportunities. Those greenways, they allow us to engage with historic infrastructure, such as disused railway is a good one. I mean, I live not far from the old rail trail. So, you're constantly engaging with the old railway architectural heritage, so it gives people an opportunity to engage and interact and appreciate and have that sense of place with that cultural heritage. It is important, though, that when we are recommending opportunities to engage with particular sites, that we do have great supporting arguments. We need to be able to kind of put the case, make a case that something has that opportunity to be an amenity, or to be something that we can, even if it's passive interaction, that we can make the case that particular site, will make a valuable contribution to the project. So there might be a website, for example, which highlights an important local cultural heritage asset like a castle, obvious example. But we also can look at the county development plan. We can look at the heritage plan in particular for the local authority to pick out some of those potentially key places. Geoarchaeology and paleoenvironmental archaeology is something that I mentioned earlier when I was going through the various types of specialist assessments that one could undertake at phase 2 and phase 3. But most of us, I think, would be familiar with this sort of work, paleoenvironmental coring happening as part of the post-consent archaeological services in stage 1. And obviously these need to be carried out by competent specialists as well. But for these kind of studies, there are other sources that we can look at, desktop sources such as geotech reports, borehole logs, things like that, soils and subsoil maps, geotech data. There's published analysis of Irish quaternary pollen sites, and so there's the Irish pollen site database, there's a European pollen database, and then of course there are the reports and maps of the bogs commissioners. But as with all these lists of sources, it's not exhaustive, but it is another aspect, another layer of information that we can tap into. So that's the end of part 3, the key inputs. So we can open it up again to questions, Ellen and Ronan.
Yeah, thanks, Bryn, for keeping to time again. Okay, so there's a question came in via email. Something that is not addressed in the guidelines but comes up at emerging preferred route stage, early EIA or stage, is site investigations, especially for road schemes where they need to be screened. With the works within ZONs require Section 12 notification as the project pre-planning at that stage, rather than having gone through the planning notification, rather than the planning process, which removes the requirement for Section 12 notification. I think this is important as questions could be asked at OH as to what archaeological works were done at SI stage.
Okay, Ronan, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, look, on a lot of the schemes at the moment, we will have site investigations will be assessed as to which ones require to be archaeologically monitored, or indeed, we might actually, on a number of schemes, we'll actually request request the site investigations to be targeted at particular archaeological issues. But it is an important point that site investigations, I know it's raised in the previous slide you had there on the geoarchaeology and paleoenvironmental, that the logs and borehole logs, site investigation records, are considered as part of the archaeological by the cultural heritage professional, and also that in some cases that those actually are monitored, archaeologically monitored by the CHP during the works.
I think, yeah, thanks for that, Ronan. In terms of then the Section 12 notification, how does that work?
Section 12 notification, in some cases, we have actually gone to the department. I know local authorities have gone to the department seeking Section 12 notification for works that are underway in the area. And generally, the practice would be to avoid actually impacting on a zone of notification during the planning process, unless there was either an overriding geotechnical reason or or is actually a value for archaeological heritage value. Mary, I see you're there as well.
Yeah, so
Right.
Ronan,
Yeah.
I was just pointing out, Ronan, that, just as you've said, obviously, ideally, we ensure that SI doesn't take place within the zones of notification, like by accident. If it just, if it isn't an absolute requirement that they really need geotechnical information from exactly that spot. But if it is required in that spot, then obviously it should be archaeologically monitored, and that should always take place under excavation license for a whole load of different reasons.
Fair point.
And once you apply for an excavation license, that removes the need for a Section 12 notification. Because it's been done under license. So problem solved.
I suppose the key point to put across to people then, who might not be aware, is that any work at or in relation to a recorded monument requires a notification to the minister. So that's what we're kind of talking about here. That's what these zones of notification are. And works obviously will include geotechnical works, so just making sure that, we're compliant with legislation there.
Yeah, absolutely. But in the context of then an archaeological license an excavation license being applied for, then that kind of trumps the Section 12 notification. So unless you're applying for an excavation license, then a Section 12 notification is required. Would that be right, Ben?
Yeah, well, that's what the law says.
Yeah.
But like you say, if you have an excavation license, you've closed that off. You have notified.
The notification has taken place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a 2-month statutory notification period under Section 12. But as you say, if you apply for the license to do the monitoring, you have the license, the excavation license in hand anyway.